Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome here to an interview with David Cunliffe, their finance spokesman for Labour. This week the Prime Minister came out with his tax reform plans, and there was some, not just a speech, but a discussion around that and in the Finance and Expenditure Committee, which you're on. What was your thought on John Key's speech and what happened afterwards?
Thanks, Bernard. It's good to be back on interest.co. Happy New Year to you and your viewers. Look, I think there's a three-way test for not only the government's speech but the package that it represents. Firstly, is it fair to all New Zealanders? I call that the equity test. Secondly, is it going to do the job and fix the problems? I call that the real economy test. And thirdly, is it politically sustainable, meaning that investors and householders don't have to cope with uncertainty, and that's the sustainability test. I've argued that the package fails all three, and it certainly cannot satisfy at least two of the three.
Why isn't it fair?
It's not fair because, firstly, New Zealanders are confronted with a regressive increase to goods and services tax, GST. It's at a time when many households have done it tough through the recession, and I know a lot of people who are just making the grocery bill meet the wage packet.
But isn't the government going to compensate people?
Well, that's the interesting thing. It's certainly possible to do that. Treasury's made some numbers available via the tax working group. It would raise about $2.1 billion to raise GST to 15 cents, and it would cost about $1.9 to $2 billion to fully compensate New Zealanders for the effect of that. Now, the interesting thing about that is, firstly, it is possible. Secondly, if the government were to do that, there wouldn't be a hell of a lot left over to fund other things they want to do, which is principally to give the very top income earners a massive tax cut. So that does raise the political question, well, why would you do it then? And we'll come on to that. But I think there's a little bit of a political shell game going on here, because if the average New Zealander thinks that the best they can hope for is to be compensated for the extra tax that's being taken off them, then I think they're selling themselves short. The real equity test is, if there are gains over and above compensation, are they being fairly shared? And, for example, moving tax thresholds would be a way that you could share the gains much more evenly than simply dropping the top tax rate under the guise of equalising it with the company rate.
You said it wouldn't work as an economic transformation exercise. Why do you think that?
Well, I think the first remarkable thing about the government speech, the Prime Minister's speech on Big Tuesday, is there was no big strategy underneath it. We call it Timid Tuesday or Tiptoe Tuesday. Because I don't think Mr Key's showing himself as a visionary leader. And I don't think we've got a government here with any sense of go forward. They talk the talk about understanding the problem. And by the way, Labour basically agrees with National on the nature of the problem. And not only we had to cope with the recession and tighten our belts, but there's an imbalance in the economy. And the imbalance is because we've got inbuilt incentives, including, but not limited to, tax incentives around investors putting their money in property. Now, for mum and dad, it's because they thought it was safer than shares. But for a lot of big money, it's because there's a tax break attached. And we need to have a neutral playing field between investment classes. And that's got macroeconomic effects that are very, very serious and, as you've said, end up really hurting younger New Zealanders.
So why doesn't Labour get together with National and come up with a bipartisan approach on property taxes?
Well, we've offered a number of times to do exactly that. As long ago as about last September, and I believe reiterated in Phil Goff's State of the Nation speech in January, and certainly been amidst the comments I've made in my House exchange this week. And an opposition, of course, makes those statements only when they mean them, and you can't keep saying it and keep getting ignored without looking desperate. So, John Key, if you're listening, we are prepared to have a reasonable, good faith discussion about tax reform that will actually do the job, but the ball is in the government's court to respond to that.
And sustainability, do you think these plans would get through Parliament?
Well, that remains to be seen. The government is today actually saying that they don't know they've got the Maori Party's support. Well, look, that's pretty crap political management. If you're in a coalition, this is almost a confidence and supply issue, for goodness sake. Previous governments, it would have potentially been seen so. They should have had those ducks lined up. Maori Party should have known what was in the package, and they should have had the votes in the bag. They shouldn't be relying on Rahui Katane to clarify it on Morning Report. Now, I can't imagine Heather Simpson letting it get to that stage. So I wonder what staff work's gone on. And John Key, If that's the real reason for him saying today, I'm not sure I'm going to do GST after all, then I would say that's a real indictment on their political management. I don't think they're that dumb. I don't think that is the real reason. I think the real reason is that GST's gone down like a lead balloon with ordinary New Zealanders, and it's going to cost the government votes, and they're starting to work out just how many, and they're terrified by the ferocity of the response.
The alternative then, if there's no GST, is to look at some form of property taxes. Of the options put forward by the tax working group, what does Labor think would be most agreeable, likely to go through?
Well, let me first come back to the supposition you're making, and let's go back to the compensation scenario. If the government's to be taken at its word that Kiwis are going to be fully compensated, then almost all, within $100 to $200 million probably, of the finance raised, the revenue raised through increased GST, would have to be used to compensate Kiwis. So it's essentially a paper transaction, a straight swap from direct to indirect taxation. So it doesn't therefore follow that if you don't do GST, you've got to do a whole lot of other property taxes. The property tax question is a separate question. It's there anyway. And I think most commentators have pointed out that, and John Shewan from Price Waterhouse, that the tax working group never recommended taking all of building depreciation away. And I think Deloitte's estimated even a full withdrawal of depreciation would only raise between 0.7 and 1 billion. PwC said 0.8 to 1.1, and that's less than the government's estimate of 1.3. Assuming they don't take all of it, they're going to be well short of what they need to drop the top tax rate to 30. And so that is a real question. I'm afraid the government's got itself into this mess, and if the government's not prepared to have a good faith discussion with the Labor Party, I'm afraid I'm not going to throw them a life raft on your website right now.
Do you think that there was a discussion in the FEC about ring fencing and a Brightline test for the issue of intent to sell? Do you think that's an area the government could look at?
Let's do some rough maths. 30, 30, 30 on tax company and trust rate. Fiscal cost $1.6 to $1.7 billion. 30, 30, 27, $2.5 billion. So the government's $500 million either side of $2 billion. Where are they going to find it from? Let's assume they get $200 million out of GST if they do it. Let's assume that they did get, say, $700 million out of building depreciation. That's $900. Where are they going to get the rest? Well, they could address depreciation loading on short-lived assets. That's $300 million. If they do all of it, they could change the safe harbour thresholds. That's $200 million. So that combination's starting to get you in the zone, but you're going to annoy a lot of high-tech people and a lot of entrepreneurs who really needed that innovation incentive around short-lived assets. Brightline tests, Bill English and FEC said, let's look at the intent question. So if you buy a rental property with an intent of selling it for capital gain, then it's taxable, but it's really hard to nail down what intent is in the law. And we tried to fund IRD to chase down the folks who've got half a dozen renters and they keep flicking them on, and that was partially but not sufficiently successful. So you come back to the question, you could either do a Brightline test or you could do what John Key said to a journalist, which was, we want to ring-fence property losses. And the interesting thing about that is the tax working group considered it and said that that was way too rigid and they wouldn't advise it. So I suspect the government hasn't quite made up its mind. I think we will have to wait and see in the budget. And of course it raises the macro question, and here I think the real debate needs to come back, is even if they do a potpourri of little bits and pieces, is that really going to be structurally enough to solve the underlying problem, which is the misallocation of capital? Why does that matter? Because we want New Zealanders to have high-paid jobs. We want to pay our way in the world. We don't want to have an external deficit that means we have to sell New Zealand by the pound in order to cover the gap. That's not a sustainable future. And I wonder whether the government in its heart of hearts says, oh, well, you know, one day we'll merge with Australia and that'll take care of it. Well, I want New Zealand for New Zealanders. I want us with a game plan that allows our grandchildren to work here in good, prosperous jobs. National campaigned on that. They're showing they can't deliver on it.
Great. David Cunliffe, thank you very much. That was David Cunliffe, the Labor finance spokesman, talking about the government's announcements on tax. And no doubt the next 2 or 3 months will be very interesting in political and economic terms.